Hi, how are you? Well, it's a blustery, rainy October evening. So I hope wherever you are when I'm recording this, you're sitting somewhere toasty and warm, possibly basking in the glow of some kind of, I don't know, fire, real or artificial, sipping on a warm beverage, just generally comfortable. This video constitutes the start of what we might maybe metaphorically call an architectural exploration of the primary structural components through which writing conveys meaning. We'll mainly be looking at this on a sentence level, but they might seem very simple on the surface. These structural components that we'll be talking about, and you'll see what I mean in a moment when we get into it. But the fact is that they're actually deeply complex and extremely multifaceted, so much so that we're only really going to be cracking the surface of these concepts, these structural concepts of writing. As you explore farther, you'll see, and I hope you'll see by the end of this video, there's a lot to unpack, and there's a lot of crazy intricacies and sort of labyrinths you can go down, labyrinths of meaning and signification, and sort of really get lost in a maze of language, if you will, which can be useful if you know what you're doing. If you know what you're doing in the maze of language, the maze of signification, the labyrinth of meaning that comes about through writing, then you can become a powerful writer. If you don't know what you're doing, you're still apt to get lost in that maze, right? If you don't know what you're doing in the labyrinth of meaning, if you don't know what you're doing in the twists and turns of the written word, it's very easy to get lost in those twists and turns. You'll never get that cheese in the middle. You will become lost in the very words that you are putting down on the page. So, in a sense, if you don't know what you're doing with words, with language, with the architecture of language, I think that's a good way to think about it. If you don't know, if you're using architectural components that you don't fully understand, you're very likely to build yourself into a corner through which meaning becomes a jester and a devil and just a trickster. The very words that you put on the page can trick you if you don't understand how meaning comes about through those words and the assemblage of those words. So the words individually, and so tonight, we'll be sort of categorizing two of the main overarching, as I say, sort of structural components of the written word. And after we make those distinctions, those categorizations, then we will be looking at one set. So this will make more sense when we get into it, so let's just get into it. All right, so let's start off by talking about making choices along the paradigmatic axis. And as I read those words, and as you read them, you're probably like, what the hell does that mean? Don't panic. There's some strange words that are about to come your way. We're going to unpack them as we go, okay? So we can make a distinction between when we write and we conceive, when we conceptualize of these architectural components, we can visualize them as choices that run along two different axes. The paradigmatic axis versus the syntagmatic axis. And the paradigmatic axis we will call, so we'll look at a visual in a second, don't worry. Just bear with me and let's build up to it. So the paradigmatic axis is the vertical axis, and the syntagmatic is horizontal. So paradigmatic you can conceive of as going up and down, and syntagmatic you can think about as going left to right. Okay. So the paradigmatic will be our primary focus of this video. The paradigmatic or vertical axis means things that are in a group according to type and can be substituted for each other. Right? Don't worry if you still don't know what that means. We're gonna unpack it, but let's just lay it all out, and then we can pick it apart. The syntagmatic or horizontal axis indicates a sequence of things that might be rearranged. All right, so let's start off with this analogy. Compare it to this scenario. Imagine that you have just moved into a new apartment that is completely empty. The paradigmatic choices you would make in that situation are the actual pieces of furniture you would pick out in the apartment. Okay, so furniture would be the group in this situation. All of the pieces of possible furniture that you could select, that is what forms your paradigmatic, your vertical axis, right? It's a group that is designated according to a group of things that are collected together because they're all of a similar nature. They're all pieces of furniture, right? So you might get a couch, a folding chair, a glass coffee table, and a bunk bed. That would be one set of paradigmatic choices. Or alternatively, you could get a divan, a beanbag chair, a desk, and a Victorian four-poster bed. Assuming you had all the money in the world, you could get any different combination of furniture to fill the space in your new apartment. This means that these choices lie along the paradigmatic axis. So any piece of furniture, in theory, you could put into your apartment, right? You could put in 3 couches. You could put in 4 couches if you had the space. You could put in a couch, a bed, a couple of beanbag chairs. You could get one giant bed, a very tiny chair to sit on, etc., etc. But then once you get all the furniture you want and that can fit, that can reasonably fit, then you have to decide how you're going to arrange that furniture. Is the desk going by the window, or will the beanbag chair go by the window? What will go along the north wall, the divan or the Victorian four-poster bed? So these are the choices you would be making along the syntagmatic axis, right? So you have your components, the furniture. That's your group according to a type. All the furniture in the world is your group, your typical group. You have to select from that group the pieces of furniture that you want and that fit, and that go with the style that you're trying to represent. And we'll talk about that more in a second, or in a few minutes. So assuming that you could get, and so assuming that financially you could buy any furniture you wanted in the whole world, all of the furniture in the world is your paradigmatic axis in this situation. How you arrange that furniture, the sequence within the rooms that the furniture is set in relation to each, that's your syntagmatic axis. All right, so let's see how this relates to language. Well, in language, when writing a sentence, the words you choose are your paradigmatic choices. The words are your furniture, if you will. And the way that you arrange those words is a choice you are making along the syntagmatic axis. Okay? So in this way, you might compare the sentence to the room of your apartment and bear in mind that certain rooms dictate what goes where. You probably wouldn't want to put the dining table in the bathroom, for example. And this brings us to word choice and more precisely diction, which we'll break down in a second. Right. So in a sentence of this kind, you can't just put the words in any random order. Nouns have to go before verbs, and articles have to go before nouns in this case, and so on and so forth. This is a very simple sentence, but it abides by certain rules. So you couldn't say it, dog, the, bus, the. You cannot say that. I mean, you could say it, but it would be meaningless, right? In the same way that you wouldn't want to put, you probably wouldn't want to put your dining table in the bathroom where you're taking a crap, right? There are certain rules of the living space that dictate where the pieces of furniture go. You can certainly put the furniture in any room you want, but if you had visitors come over, they'd probably be very confused. They wouldn't really know what's going on, and they probably wouldn't want to eat in the same room where you relieve yourself of your bowels and whatnot, right? So in that sense, you can't just, the paradigmatic choice doesn't mean just putting any word in the world in, right? We could say that all words are grouped together by the type of sound constructions, that they're all individualized constructions of sound that hold meaning. But when we're talking about paradigmatic choices, we're talking about words that can be substituted for each other because they all fall into a certain part of speech, right? So, for example, dog, cat, rat, boy, bus, they're all nouns, right? Any noun in the world could be substituted into that sentence. You could put the apple bit the bus, the pumpkin bit the bus, the cup bit the bus. You could get rid of the article and put Leonardo DiCaprio bit the bus. So you could put any noun there and it would be grammatically correct. But just because something is grammatically correct doesn't mean it makes sense, right? It wouldn't make a lot of sense to say the banana bit the bus and so on and so forth. But you could, absurd as it may be, you could put any of these nouns in and they would all make sense. The dog bit the bus, the cat bit the bus, the rat bit the bus, the bat bit the bus, the boy bit the bus. That one, I guess, doesn't make much sense. The bus bit the bus. But these are all possible paradigmatic choices that you might make. And we're talking about this right now on its most simplistic level, but don't worry, we're going to get deeper into it and why this matters. So these choices, these are your paradigmatic choices. These are your vertical choices. Basically, any noun in the whole world is your paradigmatic axis here. And here, as a matter of fact, right? So you could put anything here. I just put a few examples, but you could put any noun, and it would make grammatical sense. Or let me rephrase that. It would be grammatically correct. That doesn't mean it would make sense. So that's the first thing to consider. On the horizontal axis, on the other hand, which we will be talking about more in weeks to come, but just to give it a foreshadow. So this would be your horizontal axis. This is a very simple sentence, so there's not a lot of ways you could rearrange this and be grammatically correct about it. But there are still there's syntagmatic choices to be made here, right? So let's say you've made your paradigmatic choices. Let's say that you put the dog bit the bat, right? So let's move that up. The dog bit the bat. You've made your paradigmatic choices. Those are the words, the nouns you're going to be using. If you wanted to rearrange that syntagmatically, then it would be the bat bit the dog. Okay, so that would be making a syntagmatic choice. If you change the noun, if you change the word structure, that's a syntagmatic choice. So if you change it from the dog bit the bat to the bat bit the dog, that's a syntagmatic choice along the horizontal axis. But if you change the words themselves, if you change it to the rat bit the cat, those are paradigmatic choices along the vertical axis, okay? So pretty straightforward, I think, right? As of right now, we're still very much on the surface. We're just laying out the conceptual groundwork for things to come. And we certainly will not be covering everything in this. All right, so we'll be getting to syntagmatic choices later in another video and another time, probably next week, really. But for now, we're focusing on the paradigmatic choices you can make. So basically, word choice, right? And there are two things to consider when it comes to word choice: denotation and connotation. These words are easily confused, but it's very important that you do not confuse these words. It's very important to have an understanding when you are writing that words create meaning in different ways. It's really important. And the first way that words create meaning individually is through denotation, which is the direct, literal, explicit meaning of a word. So basically, the dictionary definition of a word. If you look up the definition of a word in the dictionary, what you see, that is what the word denotes. Okay. Connotation is the implicit meaning of a word, that which a word signifies through suggestion or association. So you're not going to find this in a dictionary necessarily. You might find some hint of it, but there are plenty of words that have meaning socially because of ways that they've been used that have allowed them to break away from their strict dictionary definition. But there are also words that have very personal connotations to us. The word summer, right? There's a direct dictionary definition of the word summer, which designates, a certain time of the year, a season, and it's really about how the sun is hitting the hemispheres and whatnot. But the word summer, we're all going to have very different connotations of the word summer. Some of us might think of going to the beach. Some of us might think of baseball, fireworks. I don't know. Whatever your thing is, whatever you associate with summer, you're going to have a personal. You're going to have personal associations that bring a different meaning to the word summer than others around you might have, right? So with regards to denotation, right? Let's look back at meaning can shift in very obvious and overt ways when it comes to denotation, right? So a lot of times, but not always, but a lot of times, choosing words on the basis of denotation is pretty obvious and clear. Dog notes something very different from cat, right? Even though we might have different associations with those words, the denotation, there's a strict reference within certain parameters, right? You want to be very precise with regards to the definition, the strict literal definition of the words that you choose. You want to make sure that everything is as precise as possible. But the trickier part by far, I think, is with how words connote, with connotations. Trying to be aware of the different associations that a word can give a rise to. And this is where your meaning can really get scrambled, right? We see this all the time. We see it in if you keep up on all the BS in the news, right, that happens, and the way that people analyze, scrutinize to a nauseating degree any kind of political speech or anything like that. And a lot of times it's really just comes down to going past what the words that a politician so and so said, going beyond what those words denote and exploring what they connote, what the connotations of those words are. So let's look at my favorite examples, which I either heard in an Applebee's or I imagined I heard in an Applebee's. I'm not really sure, to be honest. So what we're going to look at two sentences that denote pretty much exactly the same thing, but they connote very differently. They have very different associations. I think I would. Maybe I'm jumping to conclusions, but I think I'm safe in saying. So the first sentence is, "Forgive me, Father, for I have sinned." Now, again, maybe I'm jumping to conclusions, but I assume the associations you have with a sentence like this, if you were to put them in a visual image, they probably look something like that. There would be, I assume, religious implications, specifically confessional, priestly visions in your head, especially if you have any contact with Roman Catholicism or you yourself were raised Catholic or anything like that. But even just from watching movies and reading things and so on and so forth, I think I'm safe in assuming that the associations, the connotations you have would be along these lines, right? But what if we changed every word of this sentence, or almost every word? What if we changed the words to other words that denote the exact same thing, but have very different connotations? Well, let's see what that might look like. It looks something like this. "Pardon me, Daddy, because I was bad." So again, maybe I'm jumping to conclusions, but I would assume that you have very different connotations from a sentence like this. I assume at its most innocent, it would be something like that. You'd be thinking along those lines of Betty Boop type, and "Pardon me, Daddy, because I was bad." Right, so these words, pardon, forgive, daddy, father, right? They denote the same thing strictly. Because, for, I was bad, I have sinned, right? It means the same thing. The denotations are exactly the same. But the connotations, the associations you have, presumably are wildly different, wildly far apart. So on the one hand, this might seem like a very extreme example, but on the other hand, it's very easy to slip into using a word you don't want to use that gives rise to connotations that you don't want to arise from your writing, connotations that might obstruct the meaning of what you're trying to say. And again, this is very, very hard, right? Because a lot of us, we have personal subjective associations with different words, and so it can be very hard to guess what those might be. But it's important to take it into consideration that your choice of words, even though they might mean the same thing, even though they might denote the same thing, they might have very different associations, and it's crucial that you realize that, not just for the papers that you write in this class, but just for going through life and speaking to people, and even in relationships sometimes, right? When arguments arise, and not the arguments that we'll be doing, not like that, but like fights, when there are disputes in your relationships, so many times this comes down to just a simple, the wrong word was said, and the other person in the relationship has different associations with it from what you might have. And these misunderstandings arise, and then they just perpetuate themselves, and meaning just gets more and more obscure. that brings us to diction, right? So apart from just making your meaning clear, you will often want to establish a certain style, right? So diction basically means it's your word choice, but when you say diction, it implies a little bit more than that because uh, it starts to relate to style and to context, right? So there are kind of four generally accepted levels of diction. There's formal, informal, colloquial, and slang. So formal is how you should be trying to write in college. Informal is how you might be talking to somebody at the store, to a cashier, to somebody you're doing an exchange with, even somebody at work. Your friends at school, if we ever actually go back to a place where you're talking to people again. So basic everyday situations would be more informal. Colloquial implies that you're using certain kind of idioms, more kind of localized language, and then slang. Of course, slang is almost like a kind of code. I mean, you all know what slang is, but it generally implies usage among smaller groups, kind of more close-knit groups that are almost defined in part, at least, by the language that they use. But in different contexts, one level of diction might be incorrect, and vice versa. Right. So you wouldn't want to go to a job interview, say, talking in slang. You wouldn't want to use slang formal academic paper. But also, if you go out with your friends, you're hanging out, you don't want to sound like a formal academic either, right? You want to kind of code switch. Right? And so this is just stating in a different way the idea of paradigmatic choices, right? So children, kids, youngsters, youths, and brats, those would all be paradigmatic choices that a writer can make in a certain context by referring to youthful human beings, and children and kids, youngsters. These all have different associations, right? They all denote the same thing, but they all connote very differently. Let's finish by looking at some examples of different diction, different styles that are determined by the choice of words. So we could talk about poetic diction, right? So from Keats, "'Tis the witching time of night, orbed is the moon and bright, and the stars that glisten, glisten, seeming with bright eyes to listen." And so it's this very sort of haughty language. The language is chosen to rhyme. That's important. So the decision of which words to use in this case is determined by its poetic context. Night was meant to rhyme with bright, obviously, and glisten to listen. So instead of saying, apart from whatever other intention Keats had in mind, he might have chose to say, "seeming with bright eyes to listen," instead of "seeming with bright eyes to hear," because listen rhymes with glisten. So that's part of it. But in like a word like orbit, orbit is the moon. Tis, and also this is taken from Shakespeare, by the way, from Hamlet. So a whole phrase was selected because of its poetic connotations. It's already established poetic associations with Shakespeare. But yeah, orbit. Who would use orbit in their regular life? Probably not most of us. When we're down at the getting a drink or whatever with our friends, we probably wouldn't talk about the orbit moon or what have you. But this is poetic, and it's separating it from everyday speech, putting into this realm of poetry. very markedly so. We talk about academic diction, like this passage. Like Whitman, Miller participates in all three tenses simultaneously. Or rather, the distinction is rendered meaningless in the full present. Miller's full present bears also remarkable resemblance to Spangler's pure present, an ahistorical and timeless mode, in which classical and Indian cultures, having no concern for the past, present, and future, as arraying perspective, allegedly lives. Okay. So we'll talk about structure of the language too going forward, but right now just word choices, talking about tenses, distinctions rendered meaningless. This is very sort of haughty, proper speech, proper words. Instead of saying, or instead the difference means nothing in the here and the now, right? That's another way you could kind of rephrase this. Instead, the difference means nothing in the here and now. Or rather, the distinction is rendered meaningless in the full present. Right? It's this very sort of tight and proper language, almost intentionally hard to decipher at times, which is a gripe that a lot of you might discover that you have with academic writing. That sometimes it's intentionally hard to decipher. It's all part of the adventure. But that's academic diction. Very different from poetic diction, and very different from what I've decided here to call pulp diction. So this is taken from Raymond Chandler's The Big Sleep, which is sort of one of the quintessential detective novels of the earlier part of the 20th century, the earlier half of the 20th century, which gave rise to a lot of kind of noir, pulp fiction. A lot of you might know at least through parody and stuff. So here we have it, the detective speaking. Being a copper, I like to see the law win. I like to see the flashy, well-dressed mugs like Eddie Mars spoiling their manicures in the rock quarry at Folsom, alongside of the poor little slum-bred guys that got knocked over on their first caper and never had a break since. That's what I'd like. You and me both live too long to think I'm likely to see it happen. Not in this town, not in any town half this size, in any part of this wide, green, and beautiful USA. We just don't run our country that way. Right, so it's this kind of hard-boiled, slangy, so this is a novel, right? It's this kind of slangy speech, copper, mugs, well-dressed mugs instead of well-dressed faces, well-dressed people. Instead of being a policeman, being a copper. Instead of saying poor little impoverished men, poor little impoverished people, it's poor little slum-bred guys that got knocked over on their first caper and never had to break since. Right, so the word choice, the diction, this uniform diction, it creates a style. You might call it a hard-boiled style, a pulp diction, if you will. Right, so each of these, it's a very different style, and you could say each of these in completely different ways. You could say the same thing in completely different words, but it wouldn't be the same, right? It would denote the same, but connotation would mean very different things altogether. So that's the introduction for the paradigmatic axis for diction, for word choice on its most basic level. We'll be talking in days to come about the syntagmatic axis. In other words, syntax. In other words, the arrangement of words. Until then, be well, be safe, above all, be cozy.